This is the numbered skull model. The skull is made up of cranial bones, 8 cranial bones, 2 paired and 4 unpaired, and the facial bones, 14 bones, 12 that are paired and 2 unpaired. We'll first take a look at the cranial bones. The single frontal bone, the paired parietals, the paired temporals, one on this side, one on the other side, the single sphenoid, and the ethmoid, and on the posterior surface of the skull, the occipital bone. Some areas of interest that we can see are the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone, which make the zygomatic arch, the cheekbone. The nasal septum is made up of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer. The orbit of the eye is made up of 3 single cranial bones, the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone, and 3 paired facial bones, the lacrimal bone, the maxilla, and the zygomatic bone. The frontal bone, number 1, is a single cranial bone which forms the superior eye orbitals. The main portion forming the forehead is a squamous part of the frontal bone. We also see a flat area between the eyes, the glabella, not numbered. We can also see on the frontal bone the supraorbital margin, which is the superior border of the eye orbit. Also seen but not numbered are the supraorbital notch or foramen on either side, which are passageways for arteries and nerves. We also see the frontonasal suture, which is the articulation point between the frontal bone and the nasal bones. Just superior to the glabella are a pair of frontal sinuses. The frontal bone also forms the bulk of the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Forming the sides of the skull are the paired parietal bones, number 2. 23, the coronal suture, is the articulation point between the frontal bone and the parietal bones. As we've learned, coronal planes cut the body into front and back, which is why this suture is named the coronal suture. Separating, articulating between the 2 parietal bones is the sagittal suture. Sagittal planes cut the body into right and left, and the articulation point between the parietals, number 2, and the occipital bone is the lambdoid suture, number 25. Very close to 25 is a tiny bone found inside that suture, a sutural bone, which are different for all humans and depends on how the suture is formed. A single cranial bone, the occipital bone, number 3, forms the posterior part of the cranium. Some things we can see are the external occipital protuberance, the superior and inferior nuchal lines, the external occipital crest. From the inferior view, we can see the articulation point between the occipital bone and the petrous region of the temporal bone, number 26. the occipitomastoid suture. We can also see the occipital condyles, number 19, which are paired and articulate with the atlas, the first cervical vertebrae, which allows for head movement, the unnumbered and massive cavity, the foramen magnum, which allows for passage of the spinal cord, the pharyngeal tubercle of the basilar region of the occipital bone. We can also see the large opening, the jugular foramen, which allows passage to the internal jugular vein and cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. From an anterior superior view of the occipital bone, we can again see the foramen magnum, passageway of the spinal cord, and the small hypoglossal canal number 68, which is a passageway for cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. The paired cranial bone number 4, the temporal bone, forms the side of the skull. Its articulation point with number 2, the parietal bone, is the squamosal suture, number 28. There's 4 parts to the temporal bone. The part near the suture is the squamous region of the temporal bone. The part surrounding the external acoustic or auditory meatus is called the tympanic region. The function of 42 is a passageway to the middle ear or tympanic membrane. We have the mastoid region of the temporal bone. Number 5, the mastoid process, which is an attachment site for muscles. This area is prone to infection, what's called mastoiditis, and because of its close proximity to the meninges, the brain coverings, they can become inflamed, which is called meningitis. The inferior portion of the temporal bone is called the petrous region. Some markings we can see here are the styloid process, number 9, which is an attachment point for muscles of the neck, the stylomastoid foramen, number 49, which is a passageway for cranial nerve number 7, number 8, the mandibular fossa, which is an articulation point for the mandibular condyle of the mandible. Also in the petrous region of the temporal bone is number 46, the foramen lacerum, which is a passageway for the internal carotid artery and other arteries and nerves. Number 47, the carotid canal, which is a passageway for the internal carotid artery. And between the styloid process and the mastoid process, the stylomastoid foramen, number 49, which is a passageway for cranial nerve number 7. From an internal superior view of the temporal bone, we can see number 67, the internal acoustic auditory meatus, which is a passageway for cranial nerves 7 and 8. And another view of the jugular foramen, which is a passageway for cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and the internal jugular vein. The ethmoid bone, number 15, a single cranial bone, the lateral mass of which is shown here, and makes up the bulk of the medial eye orbit. Another portion of the ethmoid which can be seen from the anterior view is a perpendicular plate, which forms the superior nasal septum, and 2 turbinate bones, the middle nasal concha, which help increase the turbulence of air as it enters the nasal cavity. In life, these bones are covered in mucous membrane to help filter the air as well. 2 non-cranial or facial bones seen inside the nasal cavity are the inferior nasal concha, also turbinate bones. While not seen here, Also coming off the ethmoid are the superior nasal concha. Removing the skull cap, the major cranial bones of the skull, we see a superior view of the ethmoid bone, which forms the medial portion of the anterior cranial fossa. Some structures that can be seen from this superior view are number 58, the crista galli, which is an attachment point for the dura mater of the brain. 59, the cribriform plates on either side of the crista galli. The crista galli and the cribriform plates form the horizontal plate of the ethmoid bone. Inside the cribriform plates are very tiny olfactory foramina, which allow passage of olfactory cranial nerve number 1. Also found inside the ethmoid bone, but not shown, are mucus-lined cavities, the ethmoid sinuses, which will be visible viewing an excised ethmoid bone. Number 10 is the lateral portion of the greater wing of the sphenoid. A portion of the greater wing of the sphenoid forms a portion of the lateral surface of the eye orbit. We can also see several openings from the anterior view. Number 39, the optic canal, which allows passage for cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Number 39A, the superior orbital fissure, which is a passageway for cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, and 6, and at the junction of the maxilla and the sphenoid, the inferior orbital fissure, which allows passage for nerves. Removing the skull cap, which has the parietals, part of the frontal, and a little bit of the occipital bone, we see a superior view of the skull, and we take a look at this sphenoid bone, which comprises part of the middle cranial fossa. Now we'll take a look at some of the parts of the sphenoid which we can see from the superior view. The lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. Number 61, the anterior clinoid process. Also visible is number 39, the optic canal, passageway for cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. We can also see number 60, the tuberculum cellae, not numbered, the sella turcica, the Turk saddle, and the dorsum cellae, also not numbered, with the posterior clinoid processes. The cavity found in the sella turcica is called the hypophyseal fossa, which holds the pituitary gland. We can see the greater wing, number 62. There are several openings found in the greater wing, which we'll look at now. Number 66, the foramen rotundum. Number 44, the foramen ovale, both of which are passageways for a branch of cranial nerve number 5. Also the very tiny foramen spinosum, which is a passageway for arteries and nerves. And we have another view of number 46, the foramen lacerum, which is a passage for the internal carotid artery and other nerves as well. Also visible from a more posterior view is the superior orbital fissure, passageway for cranial nerves 4, 5, 6, and 7, more visible from the posterior view, found under the lesser wing. In this area, under a portion of the occipital bone, we find the body of the sphenoid bone, which will be apparent in the excised sphenoid bone. Our last view of the sphenoid is from an external inferior position. We can see the sphenoid bone Two structures that haven't been mentioned are the pterygoid processes. We have an inferior view of number 44, the foramen ovale, a passageway for cranial nerve, number 5. And number 45, the foramen spinosum, which is a passageway for arteries and nerves.